Hey guys, Coach Logan here again, this time with another video in my series on the elements of chess. In this video we're going to talk about development, which refers to how many pieces you have out compared to your opponent. Specifically, usually people are talking about minor pieces in this regard, so like knights and bishops. When you have out more pieces, you have more opportunities available to you than your opponent, which is an advantage. However, unlike an advantage in, say, being like up a pawn, like a material advantage, to lead in development, you will lose it if you don't use it. If you give your opponent time, they will catch up. So it's very critical to try to make hay while the sun is shining, so to speak. Okay, so let's take a look at this example from Logan Aronian, who is playing black in this game, versus Sokolov, two very strong players. And it starts with the move pawn to d4 from white. Knight to f6 from black. Pawn to c4. e6, knight to c3, and then bishop b4. The Nimzo Indian defense. I'm not going to dwell too long on the opening because that's not really the point of this, but white plays the move queen to c2 here, which, this move has sort of had periods of coming in and out of fashion. White's basic idea is he's defending his knight with the queen so that in the event of black taking this knight, which maybe he wouldn't do right here, although it is a move, white has the added option to recapture with the queen and does not have to take with the pawn, which would double his pawns, which, again, that's not the end of the world, but it's maybe something some players for white want to avoid. The drawback of a move like queen to c2 is it's not as direct a development move as white could be making. He's not really getting his kingside pieces out or getting closer to castling, so sometimes that can hurt him, and that's actually what happened in this game. So let's see what black does. Black plays d5, one of the main responses. White captures. Black captures back. White plays bishop to g5. And here Aronian plays very aggressively in an interesting way. Pawn to c5, challenging white's center immediately. White took the pawn, which is an aggressive response. I mean, it's probably one of the more ambitious ways to play this. He's, for the moment, up a pawn. But even if black were to recapture this, black will be left with an isolated pawn, which could be a long-term static disadvantage if black doesn't come up with something. But black plays here now pawn to h6, challenging this bishop on g5, which was pinning our knight. White retreats it. And here black plays pawn to g5, which is something that, again, I think that coaches would rightfully so recommend against doing such stuff when you're a newer player, like just throwing your kingside pawns, because it could compromise your king safety and your structure and all these long-term issues. But Aronian has a very direct point. He is breaking this pin that this bishop had on our knight a moment ago. So he's breaking that pin, and the reason why is he wants to activate this knight. And the way in which he wants to activate this knight is to put pressure on white's pinned knight on c3. Our bishop is pinning this knight to the queen, so black wants to play the move knight to e4 to add pressure to it. So it's a very active way of playing. I mean, Aronian has, for the moment, temporarily given up a pawn and compromised his kingside pawn structure, but he's got a mounting lead in development. His pieces are very active. Okay, here white plays bishop takes b8, and I would say this is the first example of a moment where what I said at the start really applies. Black, how would you respond to bishop takes b8? Take a moment to think about it. Okay, keep your videos paused if you want more time, and I recommend doing that. I believe in active learning, not passive learning. But if in this position, black were to just play like a natural kind of, as I call it, like a foofy move, like rook takes b8, first of all, this is a blunder on the spot. Black has a loose piece here, this bishop on b4, so white has a very common tactical trick, queen to a4 check, which just forks the king and the bishop, and black is just down a piece for nothing. So black doesn't have the luxury of a move like that. He needs to look for active solutions, and he finds one here. Instead of rook takes b8, he adds more pressure to this pinned knight with a great move here, queen to f6. Okay, so now we've got three pieces attacking this knight, which can't move. We're threatening stuff like knight takes c3. Then if the pawn recaptures, we have moves like bishop takes c3, forking the king and the rook. But also queen f6 is threatening more than just that. We're threatening to take on f2. So like if white were to, I don't know, let's come up with not such a great move here. Something like, I don't know, bishop to c7. I mean, this is not a good move. Queen takes f2 is just winning on the spot, right? Taking on f1. So white plays, I think, the only move that can keep him in the game. He plays bishop back to g3. So he evacuates his piece. That he took a piece, it was not recaptured, so he evacuates his extra piece, defends f2, says, okay, you know what, I'm under some pressure, but I'm up a piece. Show me, you know, that you actually have a real advantage here. You have a lead in development, but how are you going to use it? So black plays now knight takes c3, and white can't just recapture. I mentioned this a moment ago, but recapturing would just lead to bishop takes c3 check, and this queen is defending the bishop, and after the king moves, this rook is just hanging, and now white would actually be down in material with bad king safety and continuing problems. But instead, white finds the move to stay alive. He plays pawn to a3. Which it's a very bold-looking move, but what he's saying is, yes, I see that you have all of these potential discovery checks with the knight, but are any of them actually that good? And right now I'm attacking your bishop, so if you try something, I don't know, like knight e4 check, you can just take the bishop. So I would urge, again, for you to pause your videos and try to come up with a move for black here. I mean, this, again, it's going to highlight what I was talking about, where when you have a lead in development, you need active moves. You don't have the luxury to play, again, I use this word foofy moves, you know, kind of soft, nonchalant type of moves you can make in a quiet position. All right, so keep your videos paused if you want more time. But Aronian now just plays bishop to f5, just activating a new piece with tempo, which is a fantastic move, and just turns up the heat on his opponent. What you do not want to play here is something like bishop a5, and allow white to play pawn to b4, which will now wall off your bishop. And just now they've broken the discovered threats. They've secured this extra pawn on c5. Your bishop's under attack. If you try a discovered attack on the rook, like knight e4 attacking the rook, white just moves his rook. And white has really managed to consolidate his position and is frankly just up a pawn for basically nothing with a better position. So this is really, really not what black wants at all. No. So Aronian, who's a very strong player, finds a much better move. Bishop f5 with tempo, kicking the white queen. White plays queen to d2, which looks very bold, but he's, you know, again, he's arguing that he's got pressure on this bishop on b4. This knight doesn't seem to have a great discovery. So black plays just calmly now bishop to a5. Again, note that white cannot take this knight because bishop takes c3. This time it would be a pin on the queen. But here Aronian tries for the move pawn to b4, which was working in the previous line, but here now with black's extra development, this no longer works because black finds some excellent moves here. Let's see what happened, and then we'll come back to this position. So after b4, so again, this worked a moment ago, but with the inclusion of bishop f5 and queen to d2, this is no longer working. Black now starts just, again, continuing to turn up the pressure on white with some excellent moves here. So the first one he plays is knight to e4, okay, which with the queen on d2 and not on c2, this now is attacking the queen. So white cannot capture this bishop on b4 at this moment. White plays queen to c1 because this was not just attacking the queen, black was also attacking the rook on a1. So white has to retreat the queen, and now black again just brilliantly just keeps the pressure up on his opponent by playing rook to c8. Okay, this is really an excellent instructive example on how to use a lead in development. Black is never thinking of making a quiet move like, I don't know, bishop back to d8 or something like that. Black is just thinking pieces, you know, this is a good example of a position where pieces only go forward, they don't go backwards. Rook to c1, putting more pressure on the c5 square. So, for instance, in the game, white played rook a2, just getting his rook off of the threats from queen taking a1 at some moment. But just to show, like, if white were to take this bishop, black could now play something like rook takes c5, hitting the queen. The queen needs to stay in contact with this rook on a1, but it's not all that easy to do that. I'd say something like, for instance, if you play something like queen to d1, black just has mate in 2, queen to c3 check, and I mean there's a million wins, but the easiest is just queen takes d2. So white has to just try to find ways to stay alive here because black's lead in development is so overwhelming that any sort of opening of the position is going to be unfavorable to white. So he plays rook to a2, trying to get his rook off of the threats of queen takes a1, and also cover up his second rank a bit because checks on c3 are relevant. But again, black just continues here relentlessly. So pause your videos and try to find ways to keep opening the position. Okay, keep it paused if you want more time. Black just plays rook takes c5. This pawn is pinned on b4, so he cannot take the rook. The rook is defended by the knight. You're kicking the queen. Queen is kind of short on squares. White plays queen to a1, desperately hoping for a queen trade, which would, I mean, this would be an example of really bad play, so I don't even know if it's worth looking at, but you really don't want to play something like queen takes a1 and let rook takes a1, at which point white, for the moment, I think there's a material balance, but you're forked on c5 and a5, and your attack has fizzled a lot without your queen on the board. So instead, Aronian's not going to play that. Instead, he just plays queen to c6. Again, all systems go here, making a deadly threat of rook to c1 check, and not worrying at all about what white played, which was queen to e5 check. Note that he could play queen takes h8. We'll see that in a moment. Queen to e5 check, king to d8, and allowing this move here. No, we don't really love king to d7 because then queen takes f5 can come with check, taking this bishop, and then white is getting rid of some of these attackers and has counterattacking chances of his own. Instead, king to d8, much more accurate move. Queen takes h8 check, and now after king to d7, there's really not much left for white to do. It looked like he was, even though white has just won a rook and forced the black king to d7, there are no more useful checks for white. And meanwhile, the threat of rook to c1 from black is absolutely deadly. So at this point, white actually resigned. But again, there's just no way to deal with the threats. I'm trying to even think of what white could try here. Say, for instance, I don't know. Let's say rook back to c1. This is just getting mated. Rook to c1 check, rook takes, and queen takes is just game over. If white were to try, again, it's hard to even come up with something. This is just, I think, an example where rook to c1 is threatened, and there's just no good response here. Okay, so really an excellent game from Aronian that shows how to use a lead in development. One key position I wanted to just harken back to was after this bishop a5, after b4, before b4, pun there, white actually, if white were trying to stay into this game, he could have tried other moves. b4 was the critical error, but it's just really hard to play this position for white. So for instance, another natural move might be e3, but black could just continue with very active play, castles. Now, if white tries something like knight f3, black, again, should be looking rip open lines all costs. Don't do, kind of foofy moves. Just look to absolutely open up the position. When you have a lead in development, it means that's the time to start. That's the time to start the fight because your opponent's pieces are sleeping. So what would you play here? Keep it paused if you want more time. But yes, pawn to d4. Just, again, all systems go. Look to rip open every line possible. After knight takes d4, again, pause if you want more time, but all systems go. Rook takes d4, okay? White doesn't want to take with the queen because that's going to open up more discoveries. If he takes with the pawn, though, now we can get in new pieces with check. Rook to e8, and there's just no way out of these checks for white that's anywhere remotely convenient. Something like bishop e5, again, pause your videos if you want more time, but there's a theme here. You have a lead in development. Go forward, not backwards. Rook takes e5 check, d takes e5, queen takes e5 check. White is really struggling for a way to get out of this check. Something like queen e3 is possible, but they don't want to play something like bishop e2 because now after black just captures, he's got the queen in some danger. If the queen were to venture out with something like this, there's several knight retreats that are deadly. Something like knight to c1, the computer's pointing out. After king to d1, this is just checkmate in a couple of moves. Okay, so we'll end it there. I mean, there's other variations we could look at, but just a great example of how to use a lead in development. An excellent classic game by Aronian.